What's going on, friends? Welcome back to the Mist Podcast. I am your host, Aeromist. Today, we're going to be talking about reconnecting with the spirit and discovering exactly who you are. You are eternal. There is a part of you that is consistent with you as an entity that has nothing to do with everything that you've ever been through in this lower dimensional experience. Meaning that there is, and this you could say is the difference between your ego and your highest self. Most, if not many of us, if not all of us, have been formatted, shaped, and sponged through information as we've been through this experience. But there is a part of you that is consistent regardless of what this world does to you or what happens, right? Now, for some people, this might be that their morals change away from their spirit, that their interests change away from their spirit, that, where a lot of people end up hitting a point where they feel like they just don't know who they are, is that they've lost their connection to understanding who they ever were in the first place, living out of somebody else's world instead of their own. And some people are not established in their own sense of world, that they live in other people's worlds forever. And we just some live in this cross-reference place at all times, that their reality is only reaffirmed by the ideology of another person's reality. And many things are taking and trying to attempt to take you away from your spirit and any essence of you being a spiritual entity. And that is for the deeper reasoning of just, if you lived out the purity of who you actually are in its purest form through your lowest dimensional self, then you would be on a different level of unstoppable. And by unstoppable, it's that if you think about putting everything inside of your existence back in your control, what does that mean? That means that you are no longer being controlled by things that want to have you underneath their control, right? Food, discipline, substances, nicotine, alcohol, whatever it might be. There's an assortment of anything. These things are stripping energy from you, and they're, depending on what they are, food-wise, of course, and other things like that, can begin to inhibit where you're at in general with your connection to spirit. Now, I think I might even add on to this, I was going to do in a different episode, which would be the body's connection to spirit. Because the body plays a very important connection to the spirit, because you're in this lower dimensional avatar, and connecting that soulfully back into the energetic entire compartment of your existence is still something that is practical. And we might make this a little bit of a longer episode and tap that in. But when you're trying to discover who you are, a good part of it is just dissecting what you already know, but have probably taken yourself away from understanding. Right? Which is, if you sat there by yourself, with yourself, and you ask the questions of you go back and you go through everything that is you, but then you realistically ask yourself how much of that is you and how much of that is the product of what you were given. And then once you understand that, a good example of this is, like, in my experience, the one part of my soul that will never go away is my spirit of music and my interaction with being a musician and everything to do with creating music. Because so many things tried very hard to take that away from me when I was growing up, just in general, even when I became an adult. But it was something, no matter what, that was ingrained into my entire energetic body and my being, that's what I'm going to do. And that's not something that anything will take me away from. And the same thing also could be thinking for myself personally, because even very early on in my existence, where I did not feel like I understood things, I still was taking it upon myself to not take everyone's word to heart after a certain point, because I started to see and pay attention to where other people were not having it. It wasn't making sense. There wasn't this concreteness. And that's what gave me personally the early adoption of connecting with my spirit and myself and who I am. And if you're on this adventure and you're on this venture, you have to just think about what has influenced you and go into the purity of what your soul is away from that, right? And this might be a part of different feelings and emotions and other things that you have yet to feel, right? As if you don't understand treating yourself with like love, kindness, patience, and some form of compassion and these other things that many of us are not given, it's hard for us to treat ourselves and then find ourselves in those same areas while being diluted by the rest of the world. For instance, if you feel a lack of in general and you don't have the capability of doing something creative, because every time that you do it, you feel like there's some type of repercussion to you doing the creative thing. That is the conditioning of you being trained away from your spirit, because something inside of you has stripped you away from letting you express yourself, because the creative endeavors are a part of your expression. And if you are not able to fulfill yourself fully in what is creative to you, and this is a very broad thing because there's many, many different ways you can be creative that has nothing to do with just music and just art and just digital art. There's a dude that lives down the street from me that I don't know how they did it or whatever, but there was a tree there. They chopped the tree, but they turned the tree into like this, like actual, you could say like a monument almost. Like this person perfectly carved out like a bird, like straight out into this entire tree in their front yard. And like, you know, you can't miss it. You know it's there, but it's like that's an expression of like what they're capable of, and that's art, right? Like that's them. And that is a part of displaying the expression of who they are spiritually, right? Because their artistic expression and explanation and exploration is a part of them then communicating what they're experiencing to some degree. And that is where there seems like this disconnect from people saying they need to find themselves. You're not finding, you are rediscovering, because you always have been who you are. It's just the dilution of this world has stripped your lens away from perceiving and seeing that you already are yourself. It's just we can get trapped in the psychological manipulation of the world to be living inside of other people's worlds and building our world off of their world instead of figuring it out for ourselves. And I guess you could say this is a precursor concept of telling people to think for themselves. And that in itself is an overhauled, very difficult ideology to be bringing to the table for some people because of how everyone functions differently within their brain. Some people don't have a dialogue inside of their head or a monologue, and some people do, you know, whatever. But if you're on this realm of discovery, you're going to probably be aware enough that you need to be on the sense of discovery and your spirit is calling for you. And anyone can feel their spirit calling because you can not explain the explainable because you don't know how to explain what seems unexplainable in your head, right? And that's pretty much how it is for most anyway, is that if you were able to continuously and perpetually articulate exactly what it is that you're trying to give as like a saying, here's what I've gone through or what I'm experiencing, then yeah, anyone would be able to level with anyone with where they're at. But that but bringing the information and then going through this layered barrier of a human that then projects that outward to be understood, comprehended, or anything else. When you have any form of limitation of that, even within your articulation, then that becomes a limitation in comprehension for anyone else, including yourself. More importantly, yourself, for you yourself to be able to grasp and understand who you really are. And these can be many different moral foundation, artistic foundational points, because it can be moralistic for some people. Nobody ever comes out of the womb being inherently anything. They come out of the womb being inherently what they're taught. And that is only what everyone is a product of anyway. So some people's spirit is more strong. Or you could say in a different sense is that because energy continues to form and transform no matter what happens. So even if you're here in your third dimensional form and that form disperses, you still could have a cohesive collection of energy that might reimburse back into form. And that form could still be another human being or another. And this is when you can start talking about how the existence of your energy has been precursored through previous existences and previous existences, quote, previous lives, because you're under one existence, but a consistency of life and death or a rebirth. And those are concepts that are not the same as a spiritual reference of dying and then living again, or a rebirth or anything like that. Because what we talk about is the same thing that happens to your cells as the same thing that happens in the universe, is that energy recycles, refluctuates, repurposes, and then reconfigures back into different structures over and over, no matter what is going on. And that is the rebirthing in a different type of context, because no matter what you're even doing here, it's like a constant flow of how you biologically exist. So if you want to also have another part in understanding who you really are, then understand yourself biologically, understand what you intake to all of your senses and everything that is coming to you. Because if you begin to understand those and then you divert that into then understanding who you are, you understand what has either diluted you, influenced you, or is partaking in an adequate point of telling you who you are without you saying and being the final guess, or I say the final guess, the final guest of being able to observe and understand what is in front of you energetically. The representation that I bring to all of you is from the point of an energetic, spiritual understanding. And finding yourself can seem like a very difficult feat, but to be honest, what is the most difficult is letting go of our addictions to everything else that we have ever thought that we are, and just being honest in the entirety of our existence and facing the truth of what it is that we are. Because we can delusionally recreate and reformat ourselves into what we perceive ourselves as, but are you going to be able to take the full dignified leap to completely do a mirrored 360 of yourself and understand and know what that is without any form of distortion, without a mirror that doesn't actually act like a mirror, without walking through a clown house, the house of mirrors like you would at a clown house or something like that, and all you see is this constant dysmorphia. And there's some people that literally perceive themselves as a morphed version of themselves, and then that is the portrayal of understanding their existence to them. And so when we talk about how finding yourself at that spiritual level is so dignified by only the spirit itself and roaming within that area, as compared to what is found in the lower density part of our existence, the perception is not the same. And whatever happens here to garnish the change of your perception on yourself is then once again taking away the understanding of yourself at the same time, right? Because you're still a human, you're still underneath the same preface premise that that every single other human on this planet is subject to. But from a bad standpoint, as you could quote fully say, and from a great standpoint, which is that no matter what, we all will lose this term of form and then reform into another form. We don't know when, where, how, why, or what experience that is, but that means that there's still a consistency of the trail of your soul, is the point. And that consistent trail of your soul, even if it's an embedded point of memories from a different time or a different life of your own existence, they are still an embedded point of you being who you are, right? Just like how right now you are a DNA and a genetic collection of molecules and information that were a broken down form of what you have experienced, but not here, right? As in what you're sharing with your parents, your grandparents, their parents, and there's a certain point in your lineage that your informational gather becomes a little bit diluted and distorted, but is not inadequate, and you have to be more in tune with yourself to be pushing farther. But that is why, as you could say, there's always energy consistently with you no matter what happens. And sometimes even understanding which part of that energy is the spirit realmed energy and actually just you. But remember that you, or saying I am, no matter what, is still a dignified ego term of our existence here. We are technically all one. And that is why when you understand yourself at every single level, from the highest point of you, of the point of no ego, the ninth dimension, the point where everything there begins to either repetition, it's fractalization, or it comes at the point where you are just immersed into the collective consciousness. But that break underneath it, the scope that you zoom in more underneath those and go down in the dimensions 8, 9, 7, 6, that is where the personalization is put in. And then our characterization inside of this avatar is another way of describing and ascribing how you define I. And just breaking away from the influential layers of what's already in this density is going to be the scapegoat way for you to be able to start lifting yourself up through those dimensions and being aware of them, and then being able to rediscover and reconnect yourself with the part of you that has pretty much been waiting for you to do so your entire time in this body. Unless, and some people don't get to that point until after their form here is no longer in form. But you can still achieve this comprehension while in lower density form. And this purely comes with evaluating, comprehending, and understanding yourself to the fullest. And then once you do that, you'll understand everything. There really are no more questions left to ask. There's nothing left that you really have to siphon for, because you are the universe experiencing itself. And at that point, what you begin to understand about you, about I, is only a representation of the changing dilution of yourself to be brought down into this lower density experience. But the higher you go up and the highest you can get. I say the highest is in like when you start roaming out of and building dimensions on top of the third, the fourth, the fifth, the sixth, seventh, eighth, ninth. When you get to the highest dimension that you can attempt to perceive before there's an immeasurable amount of repetition that can never be remotely explained by humanistic points, and may never even be explained by humanistic points, because that is an ideal of something that is beyond our comprehension forever. Unless we become full cyborgs, and then that's a whole different world. But if you're not going to find yourself in this time period right now, from here and in the next 20 years, the essence of spirit can completely fall out from having the opportunity to reconnect back in within human civilization. And that will be the actual true fallout of where we're at, because whenever people can still connect back into spirit and find themselves and have discovery and have the openness to explore and express, that's when that's when we're in our times of like, okay, we can still change things around, but there will be a time where all of these things will be curated and there will be a different format of existence. And maybe that's still having a connection to spirit, and maybe it's not. But what I understand when it comes to spirit, regardless of how today's world works, is that the more you integrate technology in the way that we see it right now is detrimental. But to say at the opposite end, though, that there isn't a coherent amount of technology or informational based lines that transform in the opposite way, right? Because you could say that mycelium and the mycelial network is just a constant and consistent transfer of information, just like how we are in a non-expressive, energetic way from one to another, just as, you know, almost like planets interacting with each other, but constant energy that's moving and motioning in whichever way possible it's going to do so. So it comes to that time to let you understand that also, if you're going to find oneself, you have to sit with oneself. It's just like, even if no one's taken the time with you to do it, it's like you have to begin to treat yourself better than anyone else has. And that's when you really discover the most immaculate things. Because if you are not able and can't do that with someone else, then you can't even do it with yourself. So it is important and very imperative that you remember to treat yourself how you want to be treated, to discover and find these things, because you basically have to be a reoccurring parent to yourself in a different fashion, in a different way, so that you can rumble through all of, you could say, the generational trauma, the trauma in general, but rumbling through the distortion that has been prosed over your eyes, ears, and everything about your senses, and bringing you back into your full understanding of yourself. And it's something that every single individual can feel, way beyond what words can ever say. And so that's what is the point of putting this information out there specifically, is that those who are on the search for their own discovery, you already know who you are. And answering that question, like, truthfully from your own end, literally comes from sitting back, not affiliating with what many people might have tried to brainwash you to believe, and going off of what seems more sensical to you, but then also what seems interesting to you, away from everybody else's biases. And even you can have your own bias, and it's knowing what that is and being able to take that away to fully grasp on what you're trying to get. But understanding thyself is still understanding the concept of ourselves in our higher dimensional state, and nothing to do with your lower density state, because this density state is just the body. It's just the circle and cycles of lower energy in its existence, but it will not replicate the same way in a higher sense of density from what we're able to comprehend here. But that comprehension might be comprehensible, it's just not articulatable quite yet. At the end of the day, if you're searching for yourself, you're trying to reconnect with yourself, it may take a long time. I mean, I say a long time. It might take you some time of reflection. But if you take the time with yourself, you'll figure it out and realize that you already knew who you were all along anyway. It was just putting the puzzle pieces together to figure out, to learn what even was in the picture anyway. Stay aware, my friends, and I will catch you on the next episode.